Hi, I'm Sylvie from HR.com, and I'll be your webcast host today. We're happy you could join us for our webcast, Navigating the Pay Equity Movement and How to Conduct a Pay Equity Audit, sponsored by Trusaic and presented by Joanna Kim Brunetti and Mark Dwyer. Joanna, a former partner with Aiken Group, Strauss, Hauer and Feld, LLP, has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. She brings additional regulatory compliance experience from her pre-legal career in consulting and the aerospace industry. Next slide. Mark was formerly a senior economic consultant for the Harris Economics Group, where he provided written and oral expert testimony regarding the interpretation of empirical analysis. He directed data cleaning and the construction of empirical models, among other responsibilities. Mark also worked as a senior economist for Econ One Research Inc. and taught econometrics as an assistant professor at UCLA. This webcast has been pre-approved for 1 HRCI business credit and 1 SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. This webcast has been please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we will try to do our best to get to them. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to today's presenters.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, this is Joanna, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. So today, let me go over just a brief outline of what we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about the latest trends in pay equity, which is going to be pertinent to give you some insight into what may be happening in your jurisdiction. Basically, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and how it impacts pay equity in particular. Then we're going to go through more the nuts and bolts, where we're going to discuss how to properly conduct a pay equity audit, what the process is, and the pay equity and annual compensation process itself. And then lastly, we're going to save some time for questions and answers. Next slide. Okay, so first let me just talk to you about these latest trends. A lot has been happening in the EUs, and that's important because a lot of states have looked to the EU for insight into regulations and laws that they might themselves pass. And there's been a lot of activity in the last couple of years in particular. So under the UK Equality Act of 2010, there's been some updates to that effective 2017. And in a nutshell, employers with more than 250 employees must annually publish on their website the gender pay gap report, basically identifying the wage disparities between men and women. So in large respects, this is a kind of a shaming consequence of disparities. Now, for this year, it's been delayed because of the coronavirus, and until I think the UK feels like they've gotten a handle of what's going on with COVID, they're not going to collect data for this year until further notice. But having said that, presumably it will be reinitiated next year. France has these things called an equal pay index that became effective just last year. That was for a larger number of employees in 2019, but effective this year, 2020, employers with at least 50 employees must measure gender wage gaps and equality wage index, basically the differential between men and women in terms of pay in different metrics to show what disparities exist. And like the UK, the report is public facing, but there's also steep financial penalties for non-compliance. In Spain, effective 2019, employers with 50 or more employees must develop and release equality plans, which include pay equity audits. So there is a mandatory requirement for these pay equity audits in Spain that became effective last year. In Iceland, that is one of the more strict pay reporting requirement, and specifically they require an independent certification for employers with at least 25 employees. So it's a pretty low threshold there. But for those employees, they have to basically conduct this certification to say that they have actually achieved pay equity in terms of wages. And this is done periodically. I believe it's every 3 years. You do the reporting, and then you have to show in the 3 years that you've actually achieved it. So it's pretty strict. Other notable regions are Victoria, Australia, and Ontario, Canada. Again, these have become effective, recently, or are going to be effective recently. In Victoria, Australia, they are requiring an affirmative equality plan that the employer must implement. In Ontario, Canada, there's a separate pay equity reporting requirement. So, there is this trend internationally to push pay equity, whether it's specifically in pay reporting or, through some kind of agency or public facing, or to actually, just a requirement to conduct the pay equity audit on some level. Okay, next slide. Now, with regard to the U.S. laws, and I'm going to hold off on the pay reporting for a moment, but there has been, on a federal level, there's been an absence of what a lot of people don't consider effective in terms of legislation for equal pay. The Equal Pay Act, federal law, went into effect something like 1963 or something like that. The problem was that language was basically, the rule was equal pay for equal work. And, the way that's been interpreted, at least historically, had been basically a literal, the exact same job for the exact, for the same pay. And that's really limited plaintiffs from really pursuing it. And so, that's kind of the backdrop of states basically recognizing that that's not sufficient. And what they're doing is they're filling in the gap of that equal pay, equal work, and trying to address it to encourage pay equity. So among the law trends that have happened in the U.S. towards pay equity are one, equal pay safe harbors. That's Massachusetts, Oregon, and Colorado. So Massachusetts, there's actually a complete defense for employers who conduct a pay equity audit and demonstrates reasonable progress towards eliminating whatever pay gaps exist. In Oregon, it's instead of a complete defense, under Oregon law, employers can avoid emotional distress and punitive damages if they had conducted a pay equity audit and made reasonable and substantial progress towards closing the gap. And I point out the sort of progress because it's important to note it's not that you actually achieved it as an employer, but that you're making reasonable progress towards it. And what exactly reasonable means, it'll vary by jurisdiction. But these are protections for employers under state law to encourage them to basically close that wage gap. In Colorado, it's not as significant in terms of value, arguably, but employers can avoid liquidated damages if they conduct a quote-unquote thorough and comprehensive pay audit. So these are, means where there are safe harbors provided to employers to encourage them to conduct a pay audit. And of course, each jurisdiction will vary in terms of how they interpret progress, what's thorough, comprehensive, et cetera. So you have to be mindful of what jurisdiction applies to you. But the general idea is conducting a pay audit can provide protection for you as an employer. Another area that states have filled in terms of or comparable work. As I had mentioned earlier, we're talking about equal pay for equal work, under federal law. And what they've turned it into is instead of equal work, it's substantially similar work, comparable work. Again, that's going to vary by jurisdiction exactly what that means. But what that does is it fills in fills in what exactly the same job or a comparable job is. So perhaps under federal law, you're looking at two people, one man, one woman, for example, and the job is a custodian. The man has the title custodian, but the woman's title is housekeeping, but they're in fact doing similar tasks that require similar skill. Some jurisdictions would consider that comparable work, for example, or substantially similar work. And so under a more literal, strict reading, like perhaps what had previously been interpreted under federal law, what the sort of softening of that, what equal means, is allows more people to be considered comparable in terms of their work, and it allows more plaintiffs effectively to claim pay discrimination. So what this is it's the stick method, if you look at it from an employer standpoint, to eliminate the pay gaps. And where these, the states that have these kind of loosening of what equal work means, California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Oregon. Another area to encourage pay equity audits is limiting affirmative defenses available to employers that are alleged to have engaged in pay discrimination. Under the Equal Pay Act, 1963, there's 4 bases to claim there's no gender pay disparity when, if you look at the raw data, there appears to be a pay gap. So the 4 are seniority, merit, something called systems, which measure earnings by quantity or quality of production. In some jobs, you're not paid by a dollar amount per hour. It'll be paid by the number of widgets that are processed, something like that. And then there's this 4th factor, and it's this 4th factor that's key, and that's where the largest gap in enforcement resides. So this 4th factor is what's called a differential based on any factor other than sex. And what's happened is a lot of state jurisdictions have interpreted that more narrowly to basically limit that factor other than sex to what they call bona fide factors. In other words, factors that are directly job related and consistent with business necessity. So it can't be just any old factor. It has to be a factor that's very apparent in terms of being related to work. So as I mentioned, seniority, merit, quantity, quality. Another factor, could be, for example, there's a hazard involved, like, it's a job that has some danger involved, and there might be a premium towards that. That could be a bona fide factor. But clearly, this person's a man, this person's a woman, and therefore that's why he's getting paid more. That would not be, a legitimate factor. So they have to be job related, and the jurisdictions that have these kind of affirmative defenses, basically California, Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. As you can see, they're largely what we see politically blue states. But it's hard, it may be that it goes to other states as well. There was also this federal Paycheck Fairness Act that came out. That was proposed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it has been proposed several times over the last decade, but hasn't passed yet. But it may be that with the upcoming congressional election, or sort of what the environment is, after the November election, it may be reintroduced. But what that Paycheck Fairness Act does is it basically codifies this 4th factor to be bona fide, similar to those states that I've mentioned, that limited to business-related factors only, or what often legitimate factors. And then finally, another area to encourage pay equity audits, to encourage pay equity, is this increased emphasis on pay transparency. Now, as I've mentioned to you a few minutes ago, internationally, pay data reporting is increasingly required. In the U.S., that's really still been largely the government contractors. Like in New Jersey, there's pay data reporting that's required, but that's increasingly becoming the case. As you may have been aware, the EEOC under the Obama administration had this pay data reporting, what was called Component 2 EEO1 reporting. That under the Trump administration basically ceased that activity. Again, depending on where the political climate is, that pay data reporting may be reinstated. Another area of increasing emphasis on pay transparency is salary history bands, and that has been significant in that there are 17 states, including Puerto Rico, that have had enacted salary history bands. And what is it? Basically, an employer, negotiating with a job applicant for for a position at the company, cannot ask what that person made in their prior job, or what their sort of salary history. And historically, employers have often used what a person made before to use that as a platform to determine what they're going to offer that person. In these states with these salary history bands, you can't do that. Some states have taken it even further. In California, it requires employers, if the job applicant makes a reasonable request to provide the pay scale for the particular job position, that employer has to provide it. So it changes the negotiation circumstances, and the theory behind it is it makes it more favorable to people who, from a discrimination standpoint, were at a disadvantage because their starting point at their last job, because they were a woman, for example, was why they were paid less than some other job applicant. So it's an attempt to kind of even the playing field. So as I mentioned, there are 17 states in Puerto Rico that have enacted these salary bands. There's also 20 cities that have also enacted it, including New Orleans, Jackson, Kansas City, so not all blue states. Okay, so next slide. So there's also another interesting thing that's been coming is this notion of pay equity analytics coming out of litigation. So in the Chen versus Western Digital case, that's a very recent case, there was a settlement, a monetary settlement of almost $8 million, but additionally there was programmatic relief in the form of statistical compensation analysis designed to measure evaluation, promotion, and compensation of female employees. Put another way, part of the settlement was that the employer was going to be required to engage in these sort of pay equity analytics. Same with Uber, that was a couple of years earlier. It also required that kind of analysis on the employer. Interestingly, last year in Lindsay versus Systemax, in that case, the court actually had opined in his opinion that the statistics alone could establish a Title VII prima facie case. In other words, if the raw data shows a huge or egregious pay gap, that alone could state a claim. So this is sort of paving the road for the data is there. The question is, do you know what that data says? Okay, next slide. Now, everybody has had coronavirus on the mind for the last 3 months, but the notion that because of the pandemic, unlike the pay equity reporting in the UK, which put the reporting on hold, the litigation and the claims that can come out of it, that has not been put on hold. And what we're seeing is, plaintiffs' lawyers are starting to smell blood in the water, and so they are becoming more and more active and aggressive about it. And what you'll see is there's been increase in COVID-related litigation. Certainly not all of it is pay discrimination, but that's coming. And the way litigation happens is it tends to be slow, and there's a lag between the issue and then litigation that flows out of it. So we expect a lot more of this to be coming down the pike in the pay discrimination context, and I'll give you some reasons why in a minute. There's also been high-profile cases that continue to make headlines despite the fact that we're in this pandemic. In April, Oracle just had a judge certify a class action for pay discrimination. In March, the OFCCP and Cisco, resolved a pay equity claim for $2 million in wages, lost wages, and $2.75 million in pay equity adjustments to employees nationwide. And more recently, the U.S. women's national soccer team has now, appealed to the Ninth Circuit on their equal pay claims. So there are some high-profile cases going on, notwithstanding the pandemic. It hasn't put it on hold. Next slide. And I wanted to talk to you about why these plaintiffs' lawyers are smelling blood in the water. So unlike the financial crisis in 2008, this is the mortgage debacle, this economic downturn will lead to more job losses to women than men. There are a number of reasons for it, but the most apparent one is that the burden of housework and child care still fall mostly on women in this era of work from home. And as some of you have experienced, is child care facilities being closed, helpers at home not being able to come because of these shelter in place. So you end up having men and women who can telecommute are working from home, and most of the child care, or certainly the burden of it, is falling on women instead of, as opposed to men. So they are having a tougher time trying to, telecommute as compared to men. There was research done by Northwestern University, University of Mannheim in Germany, and University of California, San Diego, which predicted that the coronavirus pandemic would disproportionately impact women. And it's interestingly now with the frontline workers, specifically healthcare, they have seen a significant increase that women are making up 78% of this frontline field. And even though they make up 78% of the frontline area, they're making less than their male counterparts across the board. So this is just, an environment for litigation based on pay discrimination that's going to be coming down the pike. Next slide. Okay, so we've kind of talked to you about, there's a lot of reasons to do a pay equity audit. Well, what is it? It's an analysis of your workforce that identifies the pay disparities and ultimately what could lead to potential liabilities to an employer. And as part of this analysis, it's going to place statistical weight on legitimate business factors that contribute to the pay gap. So if you just look at the dollars made for men and women, and you just across the board look at what the difference is, that's just the raw pay gap. It's there, and but there may be legitimate reasons why some of the men are getting paid more. And what this pay equity analysis can do, if it's done right, is it places the appropriate and defensible weight to those factors that will shrink that gap. And so that gap will not be as severe as the raw data might imply. And what it does is it helps you identify also what the root causes are for the various pay disparities amongst the different job titles, et cetera, and why it exists. So it will help you quantify the risk. It'll help you devise the right remediation strategy, and it will also be useful to track progress in terms of whether or not that pay gap is being reduced. And it also improves recruitment, retention, and public relations, that, being an employer committed to pay equity. And importantly, overlaying all of this is it can be protected as legally privileged under guidance of an attorney or overseen by an attorney. Next slide. Okay, now in doing this pay equity audit, executive sponsorship and coordination, those are key to a successful pay equity audit. Trusaic had sponsored a survey by the Harvard Business Analytics that took a swath of executives and senior management comparing the U.S. and U.K. And, not surprisingly, what they found in terms of the external drivers that are motivating organizations to conduct a pay equity audit, what I actually found surprising was how important hiring, retention, and competing for talent was. Another area was the reporting requirement, which clearly applies to the UK and less so to the US. And also equally mitigating legal risk. I mean, I think all of us recognize that as an issue. The question is how big that risk is, but that is there, and that is a a large driver to conduct the pay equity audit. But, you know, putting aside the litigation exposure, but competing for talent is very important. And, you know, it's hard to say exactly what the coronavirus pandemic will do in terms of the economy, but until the coronavirus hit, you know, their talent was scarce. It's hard to say, especially depending on the type of business that is conducting the pay equity audit. That talent may still be scarce. They also found that, you know, it's HR and senior management that are most likely going to be championing the pay equity audit. Another survey that Trusaic had conducted was with its pay equity advisory panel, who are made up of senior executives in human resources compensation, and echoing the Harvard survey. You know, implementing a pay equity solution will support better public relations. It protects the company and the CEO's reputation. And that the pay equity audit can easily be initiated by HR, but you need to get the C-suite buy-in to be effective in it. Another important thing that they had pointed out was the need to adopt an annual cycle mindset. And the reason for this is when you do a pay equity audit, it takes a snapshot. But, you know, most employers will have employees coming in and out throughout the year. People get fired, people quit, new people get hired, people get promoted. All of that fluidity is going to change the workforce that you've analyzed. And so what you analyzed 2 years ago doesn't have the same look anymore. And so if you want to be effective in your pay equity audits, you're going to want to do it periodically, and you're going to want to track progress, because, you know, part of the whole pay equity analysis is you run the analysis, and then it creates a prediction of what a person in that particular job category should be paid based on the workforce analytics. And so seeing how that predictive model and what people are actually getting paid, comparing that is important. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, you know, I had kind of alluded to this quite, you know, earlier in the presentation, the need to be, you know, to take advantage of safe harbors. And what we've seen is a lot of HR managers, they're concerned that conducting a pay equity audit will reveal things they don't want to find. But at the end of the day, that data is there. And kind of what I was talking about in Lindsay, they're saying is if that pay equity gap is that egregious, that could be a prima facie case for pay discrimination. It's there whether you do the analysis or not. The question is waiting for the plaintiff's lawyer to do it for you, or you being proactive about it. I put in a couple quotes there that, you know, from famous people that really talk about, you know, not doing anything has a cost to it. You know, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing. And the worst thing you can do is nothing. I thought that was really apropos of pay gap analyses. Now, if you do nothing, there's a significantly bigger cost to reactive analysis through, you know, litigation when there is some forced settlement or judgment. You know, in our Pay Equity Advisory Committee unanimously agreed that proactivity is essential. You got to do the analysis to determine what you want to do. If you don't know what the data reveals, you can't do anything about it. So it's really important to be proactive. Okay, next slide. Okay, so all right, we got to do one. How do I start? How do I begin? What you want to do is you're going to want some analytics experts to handle the statistical analysis. Most HR people don't have that capability. And as I had mentioned earlier, you're going to want, you know, if you want to have it privileged, you're going to want to have attorney oversight. You also want an in-house team in place who will know what all the data is to help gather that data, and having a plan before you start doing that. Now, there are solutions out there that they do it for me or they do it yourself. The do-it-yourself one is basically software solutions that you can just kind of crank the numbers to, but it's sort of a, you know, it makes you got to know what you're doing. And so that's the risk of that. And the overwhelming viewpoint is do it for me is better. Obviously, if you have outside experts, they can advise you on what data to capture, what to review and analyze, and they have the knowledge to conduct it correctly. And there are organizations that will do that sort of raw pay gap analysis to identify potential actual disparities, without looking at the business factors or with looking at them. Those are out there. We're an organization that will do that at no cost. There are, you can do that so you aren't blind to what the pay equity disparities are. There's also, solutions out there where it's, no cost pay equity consultations to get your questions answered. We're an organization that can do that. When you get your plan ready, you take it to the executive team to make the business case of why this is valuable and ultimately save the company money. All right, let me turn it over to Mark, who will do the next slide.
Thanks, Joanna. Yes, so just picking up there, what I'd like to talk about is the importance of the data and attention to the data that's going into the pay equity audit. By now, everyone here is probably aware, most people are aware, that the whole process of the pay equity audit needs to be directed by counsel, by an attorney, to ensure that the audit is covered by attorney-client privilege and or the attorney work product doctrine. This includes, in particular, the counsel directing the data pull, this initial phase, and being present on all calls and emails related to assembling the data for the audit. That's one caveat, especially if you're doing it yourself. Once the data is assembled, it is at this point that interpretations, errors, and omissions come to light and need to be addressed. Some examples, historical payroll may be out of sync with current employee positions. Data such as performance reviews may be missing for different reasons for different employees, each of which needs to be treated differently in the audit. There can be inconsistencies across systems that may cause employees to be misidentified in terms of their overtime exempt status, full versus part-time status, hourly versus salary pay designations, or even their EEO1 job category. Also, the data can reflect inconsistent or unidentified differences in compensation periods, such as whether compensation is paid weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly for different employees, or even for the same employee playing different roles, fulfilling different roles. Interpreting, cleaning, and aggregating the data correctly before the analysis starts helps to avoid drawing wasteful and counterproductive compensation conclusions. These erroneous conclusions can be of two forms. First, what looks like an unexpected pay disparity may actually be justified once employees' positions and attributes are correctly accounted for. Second, there may be a disparity hidden between groups with comparable pay. For example, if one group has substantially more of some business-related characteristic, like their tenure is misidentified or their experience, that is not correctly identified in the data. Next slide, please. Okay, so now pay equity audit deliverables. We've just seen how important getting the data right is to a pay equity audit. Here, we're briefly touching on 4 deliverables that a pay equity audit provides. First, in addition to measuring overall pay gaps, as Joanna alluded to, across protected classes, the pay equity audit explains those gaps in terms of class differences and the legitimate factors that drive pay differences. These explanations are referred to as gap decompositions. For example, what portion of pay gaps are due to differences in tenure or experience or job types between men and women or between different races and ethnicities? These findings have implications for diversity and inclusion efforts. Differences in these legitimate pay drivers can be indicative of problems with retention, promotion, mentoring that disproportionately affect certain protected classes. That's the first thing, is understanding what's driving the gap. Second, the pay equity audit measures the portion of pay gaps that remain after controlling for those legitimate business factors. These are pay disparities. Pay disparities represent more immediate liability risks for the employer, as Joanna indicated. Protected classes that have pay disparities are referred to as impacted classes. So if I talk about an impacted class, it's the class where we see a pay disparity. The third deliverable from the pay equity audit, there's much that a pay equity audit can provide in explaining the root causes of such pay disparities. Identifying these sources allows you to deploy policy and procedural remediation strategy to tackle those causes that gave rise to the disparities in the first place and would likely generate similar future disparities. Today, though, we're jumping over these organizational remediation elements so that we can focus on remediation strategies related to compensation adjustments and to the annual compensation cycle. After the pay equity audit, you know what your pay disparity is. You have a strategy for addressing the root causes of future disparities, but what should you do about existing pay disparities and how should you go about it? And that's where we get to this fourth component of it, fourth deliverable, which is the compensation remediation. These questions are addressed by this fourth deliverable, namely guidance and tools for compensation remediation. At a high level, the compensation-based remediation strategies fall into two types, an all-class approach and an impact class approach. Under what we call the all-class approach, the budget that you've allocated for addressing pay disparities is distributed among the most underpaid employees, the employees with the greatest degree of underpayment, regardless of whether they belong to a protected class with an identified pay disparity. That is, whether they belong to an impacted class or not. Just anybody with the largest underpayments, you focus on those first. Under the alternative strategy, which is the impact class approach, this same budget prioritizes underpaid employees in protected classes with pay disparities, so impacted classes. No one approach fits all organizations. Blends between the quote-unquote all-class and impact class approaches are possible. The all-class approach is less efficient in reducing pay disparities. The stronger the identification of root causes of the pay disparities, the more comfortable your counsel may be with a more targeted impact class approach. Next slide, please. Okay, that brings us, with that overview of the pay equity audit and its deliverables, that brings us to the audit compensation, the annual compensation cycle. This is the most natural place to make pay adjustments that will positively impact your organization's pay equity status. And that's during this annual compensation cycle. The annual compensation cycle makes adjustments to base, determines bonuses, and makes discretionary equity awards. According to one study, 82% of companies in the US make their compensation adjustments at the same time each year on the sort of annual cycle. While most US companies rely on compensation management software, about 40% of companies in the US are using spreadsheets to manage this process. That's fine from a pay equity audit perspective. The larger the organization, the more likely that they're using the compensation management software to manage the annual compensation process. We've represented in this figure here the annual compensation cycle as consisting of three phases, beginning with a guidance phase, a proposed adjustment phase, and a calibration, and then finishing up with the calibration phase. The first guidance phase conveys salary market results in terms of industry min, average, max, and compa ratios, how performance ratings should be tied to compensation adjustments, as well as several levels of budget considerations to guide managers as they make their compensation decisions. The first guidance phase also specifies minimum and maximum compensation boundary conditions. So we're going to talk a lot about those boundary conditions, as well as some type of trigger mechanism to alert managers who are recommending adjustments outside those ranges. So that's the first guidance phase. The second proposed adjustment phase is where managers synthesize and apply the information from the guidance phase to make compensation recommendations for their direct reports. In the third calibration phase, proposed compensation adjustments move up the management chain through the approval process. It's usually here that HR leadership is able to find hotspots and make adjustments or inquiries and ensure overall alignment with the organization's budgetary and compensation goals. It's only after this compensation phase that compensation changes are put into effect, communicated to employees, and entered into payroll systems. So that's sort of an overview of the annual compensation cycle. Next slide, please. Okay, so incorporating pay equity remediation into annual compensation guidance. Here we take a look at how the pay equity audit can interact with the guidance phase, that first phase. Through the guidance phase, HR and finance build in conditions to keep managers within pay boundaries that reflect individual performance, market salary conditions, and budget restrictions. These pay boundaries take the form of a recommended range table for different compensation types, whether it be merit, bonus, or equity compensation components. Pay equity results can be readily incorporated into these same recommended range tables to advance pay remediation objectives. Pay equity objectives often affect both the lower and upper portions of the recommended ranges because the pay equity audit identifies any employees with inexplicably high compensation as well as those who are underpaid. Restraining further compensation increases for overpaid employees can further remediation efforts as well. These compensation containment boundaries provide some degree of offset, it's worth noting, to the wage increases targeted to underpaid employees. So bringing down, or not bringing down, but limiting wage increases for those who are overpaid is an important component sometimes of getting to being effective in remediating pay disparities. Since the overall recommended pay ranges continue to reflect multiple objectives beyond pay equity, they do not disclose the specific results of the pay equity audit. Higher minimums for some employees can also be due to market conditions and or budgetary factors, and the same applies to lower maximums for other employees. In the next slide, we'll consider the role of pay equity adjustments in the second proposed adjustment phase of the compensation cycle. So that's where we are, right? Real-time monitoring of the impact of compensation adjustments. So one of the things the pay equity audit does is it produces a predictive model. The predictive model can measure the effects of managers' proposed compensation adjustments on pay disparities in this proposed adjustment phase of the cycle. This means that leadership and HR could monitor in real time or near to real time the pay equity impact of each of the proposed compensation adjustments that managers are making, as those proposed adjustments are being entered into the compensation system or into shared spreadsheets. However, the disadvantages of such real-time monitoring tend to outweigh its advantages. The main advantage is being able to act early in terms of responding to gaps between guidance and actual proposed adjustments. There are several disadvantages, though. First, it's usually difficult to see what the net effect on the organization's overall pay equity situation is going to be when you're looking at an individual manager's decision. There are just too many moving parts to make that a meaningful place to make assessment. It is not until the proposed adjustments have been made concrete across the organization that you can reach sort of more concrete conclusions. The exception to this might be where there's just a very limited number of managers who are the source of the pay disparity. A second disadvantage is that proposed compensation adjustments that are at variance with guidance are usually best reviewed within the context of the whole organization because there could be systematic issues that could be identified. The third disadvantage is that individualized interventions may make equity remediation more discoverable. For example, intervening with individual managers may reveal more about impacted classes as identified by the pay equity audit than you may want to reveal. So for these reasons, although the predictive model can be employed in this proposed adjustment phase, the circumstances under which this is advantageous are limited. We sort of discouraging that in most cases. In the next slide, we'll take a look at the third component of the phase and how paid remediation enters into that, this calibration phase. So next slide, please. Okay, so pay equity remediation and the annual compensation calibration. So the third part of the annual compensation cycle is the calibration phase. And that's where proposed compensation adjustments are vetted and defended, and it's often vetted and defended at several levels of management. In this phase, the compensation management software can share proposed compensation adjustments with the pay equity audit predictive model, so these two things can interact, to assess the net effects of the proposed changes on pay disparity. This assessment provides a clear answer to the question, has the incorporation of remediation goals into the compensation guidance in the first phase improved the overall pay equity status of the organization, and if so, to what degree? Having this second look at the pay equity during the same compensation cycle is particularly valuable because it is less likely that additional factors such as workforce demographic changes have moved pay equity results. This helps in understanding how pay equity will evolve after the compensation cycle. When leadership reviews these pay remediation progress measures as well as external competitiveness and budgetary constraints of the proposed compensation changes, they can ensure that not only did they successfully execute the annual compensation cycle, but that it was conducted in a way that improved the pay equity status of the organization. Also, these interventions at this point are organization-wide. They're justified with respect to a broader set of considerations and comparisons that would be credible in the second phase, that if you were trying to do the sort of micromanagement of the compensation adjustment proposal. Okay, so during this calibration phase, exceptions to guidance should also be reviewed, and this is really important, okay, because there could be systematic issues or trends in terms of where the guidance is, where you're getting pushback among managers and their compensation decisions. Trends in these guidance exceptions can reflect prevalent views among managers that the pay guidance is not fitting compensation realities. This suggests that revising the guidance might be a better option than forcing managers into compliance. This ability to accommodate prevailing views regarding compensation realities is much less apparent, again, if you were trying to intervene at that second proposed adjustment phase. So it's really better to do it when you've got the big picture in front of you. Earlier, I started off here reviewing how getting the most out of the pay equity audit requires resolving data issues in the available legitimate pay factors first before actually running the analysis. But compensation can also vary due to legitimate factors that are not tracked or are not readily available. Such missing factors can become apparent through these trends across managers and compensation proposals that are at variance with guidance. Identifying and formalizing and tracking these additional compensation factors will improve subsequent pay equity audits and in turn improve the future alignment between compensation guidance and proposed adjustments. Okay, so that's another benefit of working at this part of the phase. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are our recommendations? To sum up, conducting a proactive, privileged pay equity audit is the best response to a number of recent developments, including the increase in pay equity legislation at the state and local levels throughout the U.S., the increase in pay equity legislation internationally, something we didn't really touch on, are the political implications of demographic trends at the national level. In the litigation context, the increasing emphasis on statistical analyses that are used in pay equity audits, the renewed awareness of discrimination in the wake of the disproportionate health and economic impacts of the pandemic on Blacks, women, and mothers, and also the emphasis on awareness of discrimination following the tragic killings of George Floyd and too many others. Additionally, as Joanna also had some great quotes there, it's just important that inaction is all too easily construed as indifference. So it's another variant on sort of motivation for conducting this and having a look. In terms of conducting the pay equity audit, most experts agree that engaging an external pay equity provider to work with your counsel, your HR leadership, and your database administrator in a privileged capacity is the best approach. The results of the pay equity audit provide insights into appropriate organizational remediation steps and pay remediation strategies that are tailored to budgetary limitation. Pay remediation strategies are readily incorporated into compensation adjustment guidelines, as we've just run through, and reevaluated for effectiveness in the calibration phase of the compensation cycle. What we have yet to touch on is that the annual pay equity predictive model also provides the foundation for ongoing monthly monitoring of your organization's pay disparities and headline pay gaps as the composition of your workforce evolves. If you haven't done so already, a great place to begin is with a pay gap analysis to identify that headline exposure. This headline pay gap is what a full pay equity audit seeks to address. The results of the pay gap analysis can help support the case for a pay equity audit with your organization's leadership. Or if your organization is not ready to have basic payroll data reviewed, at least conduct a pay equity consultation with an expert organization that can answer your questions and help strategize the next steps in your pay equity journey. Trusaic will perform a pay gap analysis at no cost to you and turn around those results within 72 hours upon receiving your high-level payroll data. Alternatively, Trusaic also offers pay equity consultation at no cost to you. To take advantage of either of these options, simply answer yes to the next poll question, our first poll question: would you like a free pay gap analysis from Trusaic? We are experts in pay equity audits. Here's our poll question, so I'll give you some time to answer that. Our mission is to build better workplaces so our clients can build better businesses. So we'll just give some time to get some answers here to this first poll question. So the poll question is up. Have another minute or so.
Okay, I'm going to close down the poll in 10 seconds. And I've closed the poll. Mark, would you like me to launch the share the results or no?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay, so 19% are interested in getting a free pay gap analysis from Trusaic. That's 63 respondents are interested in getting and we'd be happy to provide that. So please, we'll be following up with you on that. So at this point, we have some additional poll questions, I believe. Here's our contact. Before we get to those, here's our contact information. There's phone and email addresses for myself and for Joanna. And that brings us to our second poll question, which is one of the reasons why you may not want a gap analysis is because you have already conducted a pay equity audit. So have you already conducted a pay equity audit?
Okay, I'll give it another 10 seconds. And closing the poll.
Okay, so we're at about 39%, 129 responses have already conducted a pay equity audit, whereas the majority, 62%, have not. And if you're not ready for a free pay gap analysis, again, consider just getting some consultation on the issue. A gap analysis does not require a lot of information, and that's why we can do it with a pretty quick turnaround, but it is informative as to sort of the headline exposure that you might be facing. Okay, we have another, again, 39% have conducted a pay equity audit, just for the record. And so now moving on to poll question number 3. We're curious how many of you are federal contractors? So poll question number 3 is your organization a federal contractor? The reason for this again is a yes or no question. In general, government contractors, whether working under state, municipal, or federal contracts, often have additional reporting requirements regarding pay equity, some of which Joanna highlighted earlier. In 2017, there were 4.1 million federal contractors. It's a big group. The U.S. government is becoming increasingly dependent on contractors. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, enforces the Title 41 requirement that federal contractors evaluate their compensation systems for bias. So very explicitly in the federal code, federal contractors are required to evaluate their compensation systems to determine whether there are gender or race or ethnicity-based disparities. Nevertheless, one of the things that's come up in a recent court decision or administrative decision regarding Oracle and the OFCCP is that the OFCCP has recognized that proactive pay equity audits can be covered by privilege. For federal contractors, it makes sense to have conducted a privileged pay equity audit before the OFCCP conducts their own. Okay, so we've got 21% of our audience are federal contractors. Okay, 65 out of our participants, 21% are federal contractors, and the remaining are not. Okay, and I think that brings us to one more poll question, and this would go to it would be directed at those who have conducted a pay equity audit. So Our fourth poll question is, if you have already conducted an annual pay equity audit, have you included pay equity boundary conditions within your annual compensation tool? So like we've just discussed in that guidance phase of the annual compensation cycle, have you actually taken that step of putting in some pay remediation guidelines to into your guidance for compensation decisions? Again, we're just sort of asking that as a simple yes or no. Some reasons why you may not have is that the coronavirus pandemic has substantially disrupted your business, and that's the primary concern right now. Your organization does not have an annual compensation cycle, or the pay equity audit found no significant disparities, or your organization opted to make direct adjustments to compensation outside of the annual compensation cycle. A couple other options are that your organization is not satisfied with the reliability of your last pay equity audit, or you have yet to formulate a pay remediation strategy. If you find yourself with either of these last two positions, where you weren't really comfortable or confident in your last pay equity audit, or you're not sure how to build that into a remediation strategy, please contact us. In addition to performing pay equity audits, we can take an existing audit, if you are comfortable with it, and assist with developing some remediation options for you. Right? Okay, so about a little bit more than a quarter, 27% of those who have conducted a pay equity audit have already built it into their annual compensation tool, their annual compensation cycle, some remediation, pay remediation, while as the majority have not. So it's interesting to see what might be behind that, what are those various motivations for that. Okay. So
okay,
that brings us, yes, to a close. I just want to thank everybody for spending this hour with us. If you ask questions that we did not get to, we will respond to them. So be sure we will follow up with you.
We might have time for maybe one or two questions. I know we only have like 3 minutes, but I thought, some of these are pretty quick. We had one question asking, what is the percentage disparity that must be considered? And I thought that might be a good question for you, Mark, if you can answer that.
Sure. Yeah. So what we refer to in our work is what do you consider a practical or economically significant disparity? That varies somewhat by jurisdiction. The OFCCP hasn't set a hardline rule on that for federal contractors, but 2% comes back and forth in a lot of those discussions. It's not something that they are wedded to, but for instance, in that environment, that there is some sort of consensus, perhaps, gelling around that point. But yeah, generally we do ask clients to pick, and we help them reach a point. And one of the considerations to that is what the size of your workforce and what your potential risk is. So for a smaller workforce, you could probably tolerate a higher level of underlying significance because the payout might not be so large. But for a larger workforce, you might want to get that down to 1.5% because you're talking about a lot of bodies in terms of exposure. So that's one of the components of trying to nail that down, that sort of notion of practical significance.
Okay, it turns out I think that's the last one because we need to turn it back to Sylvie, but we will answer all these questions that you guys have posted, and thank you so much for your time. Sylvie?
Yes, I would really like to thank our sponsor, Trusaic, and our presenters, Joanna Kim Brunetti and Mark Dwyer, for the important information they shared with us today. And thank you also to our audience for joining. There were a lot of great questions that came in, and as Joanna mentioned, we will be passing those questions on to them and they will reach out to answer those. We will be sending you an email with your credit information within 24 hours. You'll also find the credits in your View My Credits page of your membership profile once the webcast has been archived. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. I also put a link in the chat if you were able to grab that. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.